The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, unmarked except for a postmark from Alamogordo, New Mexico. I found it wedged between my apartment door and the frame when I returned from my morning run through the rain-soaked streets of Portland. Inside, 43 photographs, all black and white, all dated between 1962 and 1968, and every human face had been deliberately blurred. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and I've spent the last 12 years authenticating historical photographs for the Smithsonian and private collectors. I've seen forgeries that could fool museum curators, propaganda images from every Cold War faction, and hoaxes so elaborate they required teams to debunk. But nothing prepared me for what I held in my hands that morning, water dripping from my running jacket onto my kitchen table as I spread the photographs across the surface. The images showed what appeared to be a collaborative workspace, some kind of laboratory or research facility. Human figures in white coats stood beside others, beings with elongated limbs and disproportionately large cranial structures. The humans were blurred into anonymity, their faces reduced to flesh-colored smudges, but the others remained crystal clear. And they weren't monsters or demons from folklore. They looked biological, real. Their postures suggested intelligence, purpose, collaboration. In one photograph, human hands, visible unblurred, held what looked like a complex geometric device while slender, four-fingered hands adjusted something on its surface. In another, a blurred human figure sat at a desk covered in papers and instruments while one of the beings stood behind, appearing to observe or instruct. The setting looked institutional. Tile floors, fluorescent lighting, government-issue furniture from the mid-60s. The envelope contained no letter, no explanation, no return address. Just the photographs and a small piece of paper with a single typed line. They chose to be forgotten. Find out why. I should have called the FBI. I should have contacted my supervisor at the Smithsonian. Instead, I made coffee, set up my magnification equipment, and began the process that would unravel everything I thought I understood about authentication, truth, and the weight of knowledge that perhaps should remain buried. Some discoveries aren't meant to be validated. Some are meant to be understood. My methodology has always been systematic, almost obsessive. 20 years of training doesn't disappear because something impossible appears on your kitchen table. I began with the fundamentals: paper analysis, chemical composition of the photographic emulsion, examination of the printing techniques, verification of the time period appropriate development methods. The photographs were genuine mid-1960s silver gelatin prints, not reproductions, not digital manipulations printed on vintage paper. I've seen those, and the telltale signs are always there if you know where to look. These showed the natural grain structure, the characteristic tonal range, and the subtle imperfections that come from manual darkroom development. The paper stock matched Kodak's premium photo paper from 1962-1968, complete with the correct watermark, visible under specific lighting. I set up my workspace methodically. My apartment, a converted warehouse loft in Portland's industrial district, had served as my private laboratory for side projects for years. The north-facing windows provided consistent natural light. My collection of vintage cameras, enlargers, and analytical equipment lined the exposed brick walls. I'd spent a small fortune on a digital microscope system that could capture details invisible to the naked eye. The blurring technique itself was fascinating and deeply unsettling. It wasn't applied digitally. That was immediately obvious. Someone had manipulated the negatives during the printing process, using what appeared to be selective diffusion or possibly chemical treatment to obscure the human faces while leaving everything else in sharp focus. The precision was remarkable. Whoever did this had extraordinary darkroom skills and access to the original negatives. I created a detailed catalog, 43 images, numbered, photographed, and logged into my database. I measured every dimension, noted every visible detail, mapped the spatial relationships between subjects. The facility appeared consistent across all images. The same tile pattern, the same institutional green paint on the walls, the same style of overhead lighting fixtures. The beings appeared in 37 of the 43 photographs. They varied in height but shared common physiological characteristics: elongated limbs with visible joint structures that suggested different biomechanics than human anatomy, heads that seemed disproportionately large but not grotesquely so, skin that appeared smooth and pale in the black and white images. Their hands, always visible, always in focus, showed 4 digits including an opposable thumb-like structure. What struck me most was the mundanity of it all. These weren't dramatic scenes of first contact or alien invasions. They were work photographs, documentation of collaborative research. In one image, a being stood at a chalkboard covered in mathematical equations, holding what looked like a piece of chalk. In another, 3 blurred humans and 2 beings gathered around a table examining what appeared to be circuit boards or similar technical components. The equipment visible in the photographs matched the technological aesthetic of the 1960s. Bulky oscilloscopes, reel-to-reel computers, analog measurement devices. But some items defied easy categorization. Geometric devices with no obvious purpose. Instruments with displays that didn't match any known technology from that era. Nothing overtly impossible, but unsettlingly unfamiliar. I spent 3 days doing nothing but documenting and analyzing before I allowed myself to consider the implications. 3 days of measurements, chemical tests, comparative analysis with known 1960s government facility photographs. 3 days of trying to find the flaw, the inconsistency, the evidence of forgery that would let me dismiss this as an elaborate hoax. The flaw never appeared. On the 4th day, I noticed something I'd initially overlooked. In photograph number 17, a blurred figure stood beside a filing cabinet. The cabinet's label was partially visible. Project AQ, followed by blur, then Bro, Arius, Class, Level, Cosmic Top Secret. Cosmic Top Secret was a real NATO classification level, rarely used and almost never acknowledged publicly. Its appearance here suggested either an extremely well-informed hoaxer or something far more troubling. I began cross-referencing. Alamogordo, New Mexico, the postmark location, sat near Holloman Air Force Base and White Sands Missile Range. During the 1960s, both facilities conducted classified research spanning aerospace engineering, weapons development, and experimental technologies. The area had been associated with UFO phenomena since the Roswell incident in 1947. My academic training warred with my growing suspicion that these photographs might be authentic documentation of something that officially never happened. I'd built my career on skepticism, on demanding rigorous proof, on exposing forgeries. But everything I knew about photographic analysis told me these images were genuine products of their stated time period. The question wasn't whether the photographs were fake. The question was what they actually depicted, and why someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to blur every human face while leaving the beings clearly visible. I made my first mistake on day 5. I contacted Marcus Webb, a colleague from my graduate program who now worked in the National Archives Classified Holdings Division. I didn't send images. I'm not that reckless, but I asked hypothetical questions about 1960s government facilities, classification levels, and whether he'd ever encountered references to projects with aquatic-themed names. His response came within an hour. "Sarah, please tell me you're asking for a novel you're writing, and not because you've found something. Some areas of Cold War history are still actively classified for reasons that have nothing to do with national security, and everything to do with questions nobody wants answered." I didn't respond. But his message confirmed something crucial. There were secrets from that era that remained buried not because they endangered current operations, but because they challenged fundamental assumptions about what had occurred during those years. That night I dreamed of blurred faces in white coats, standing beside beings whose features I could see with perfect clarity, all of them working together on something my sleeping mind couldn't quite comprehend. The first indirect contact came through my mail slot on day 8. Not the postal service, someone had personally delivered it. I know because I'd installed a motion sensor camera after receiving the initial envelope, paranoid about who might be watching. The camera footage showed nothing. 47 seconds of empty hallway, then the envelope appearing on the floor inside my apartment, as if it had materialized from nothing. The timestamp read, 3:47 a.m. I'd been asleep 15 feet away and heard nothing. Inside, a photocopy of a declassified memo from 1969, heavily redacted but with one paragraph partially visible. Following the conclusion of Project Aquarius in December 1968, all personnel have been debriefed under Protocol Sigma 9. Photographic documentation has been secured per standard archival procedures. Recommend ongoing monitoring of former participants for potential disclosure events. No other message. No explanation of how it appeared in my locked apartment. I stopped sleeping well after that. My professional obligation was clear. Notify authorities, turn over the materials, step away. But something deeper held me back. a recognition that some truths carry responsibilities that institutions aren't equipped to handle. The deliberate blurring of the human faces suggested protection, not suppression. Someone had wanted the beings documented while keeping the human participants safe from identification. I began approaching the investigation differently. Instead of trying to prove authenticity, I started asking, what would make this level of secrecy necessary? Not national security. We declassified nuclear weapon designs, covert operations, assassination plots. What could be more sensitive than atomic warfare? The answer, I realized, was ontological disruption, information that would fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. I contacted Dr. James Morrison, a retired Air Force intelligence officer I'd worked with on a previous authentication project involving Vietnam War documentation. He was 83, living in a retirement community in Virginia, and had maintained his security clearances through consulting work with the Pentagon. Our conversation was careful, oblique. I described hypothetically finding photographs showing unusual collaborative research from the 1960s, with unidentified participants of possibly non-standard appearance. His silence lasted 30 seconds. Then, Sarah, in my 40 years of intelligence work, I learned that some files don't get declassified because they're still relevant. They stay classified because the people who made the original classification decisions are still alive and terrified of what acknowledgement would mean. If you found what I think you found, you need to understand that the cover-up isn't about hiding the truth from the public. It's about protecting the people who were there. Protecting them from what? From having to explain why they kept silent. From having to justify collaboration that violated every protocol and possibly every ethical boundary we had. From facing the question of whether they were patriots or traitors, when the real answer is that those categories became meaningless in that context. He refused to say more, but he sent me something 3 days later. A newspaper clipping from the Alamogordo Daily News, November 1968. A small article about a fire at a government research annex near Holloman Air Force Base. 3 casualties. Names withheld pending family notification. The facility had been conducting atmospheric research according to the official statement. I cross-referenced the date with my photographs. The last image in the sequence was dated November 19, 1968. The fire occurred November 21, 1968. The facility in my photographs and the one that burned were almost certainly the same place. I received another communication on day 14, this time a phone call from a number that showed up as unknown on my screen. A woman's voice, elderly with a slight tremor. Dr. Chen, my husband worked on Aquarius. He passed in 2003. Before he died, he told me that if anyone ever came asking about the photographs, I should tell them the truth. The blurring was their choice. The humans asked to be made anonymous. They wanted the work documented, but not their involvement. Why? I asked. Because some of them had families, children, careers ahead of them. And they knew that if it ever came out, if anyone ever learned what they'd been part of, their lives would become unbearable. Not from government persecution, but from becoming symbols. They didn't want to be the faces of first contact. They just wanted to do the work. What was the work? Survival. Theirs and ours. That's all I can tell you. That's all Charles told me. She hung up before I could ask anything else. I sat in my apartment that night, photographs spread across every surface, and tried to imagine the weight of that decision. To participate in perhaps the most significant collaborative effort in human history, and then deliberately erase your own face from the record. To know you'd contributed to something profound and choose anonymity over recognition. The contradiction gnawed at me. My entire career had been built on attribution, on identifying creators and participants, on restoring names to historical events. But this discovery demanded the opposite, respecting an anonymity that had been carefully, deliberately constructed. Other people began appearing in my investigation peripherally. I noticed the same car parked across from my building on 3 separate occasions. My internet searches started returning odd results, as if someone was monitoring and subtly redirecting my research. A colleague at the Smithsonian asked if I was working on anything sensitive, because someone had requested my employment records and publication history. I wasn't being threatened. I was being observed. And the observation felt protective rather than menacing, as if someone wanted to ensure I understood the implications before making any irreversible choices about disclosure. The question shifted from what did I find to what responsibility comes with finding it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, the paper itself, not the images on it. I'd been so focused on the photographic content that I'd neglected to thoroughly analyze the envelope's material composition. On day 19, while cataloging the original packaging for my records, I noticed something under magnification: microscopic fibers embedded in the envelope's paper stock that didn't match any commercial product from the 1960s or modern era. Under my digital microscope at 400x magnification, the fibers showed a crystalline structure that seemed to refract light in unusual ways. They weren't synthetic polymers. The molecular arrangement looked biological, almost like modified cellulose, but with a regularity that suggested deliberate engineering rather than natural growth. I contacted Dr. Amelia Torres, a materials scientist at Oregon State University, who specialized in forensic fiber analysis. I sent her a tiny sample, just enough for testing, without explaining its context. Her results arrived via encrypted email 48 hours later. "Sarah, where did you get this? The fiber structure shows characteristics of both biological and engineered materials. The cellular arrangement suggests it was grown rather than manufactured, but grown according to specifications that don't match any terrestrial plant structure I've encountered. It's not synthetic, but it's also not naturally occurring. Someone designed this at the cellular level. I need more context." I didn't provide it, but her analysis confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. The envelope itself was a message, a proof of authenticity that went beyond the photographs. Whoever sent this wanted me to understand that the collaboration depicted in the images had produced tangible results, technologies and materials that existed in my hands right now. That night, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I selected the clearest photograph, image number 23, showing a human and a being working together on what appeared to be a complex optical device, and I took it to Dr. Robert Chen, no relation, a physicist at Reed College who specialized in photonics and exotic optical systems. I walked into his office on a gray Portland afternoon, rain streaking the windows, and placed the photograph on his desk, without preamble. He looked at it for 30 seconds in silence. Then he reached for his magnifying glass and examined it for another 3 minutes. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen on his usually jovial face: profound unease mixed with scientific fascination. "This device," he said, pointing to the object in the photograph, "shouldn't exist. The configuration shown here, if I'm interpreting the visible components correctly, suggests a method of light manipulation that we only theoretically understood in the 1960s and still can't practically achieve today. It looks like some kind of photonic quantum interference system, but the architecture is wrong. Not wrong as in incorrectly designed, but wrong as in designed according to principles I don't recognize. Could it be speculative fiction? Concept art for a science fiction film? Look at the hands holding it." He pointed to where 4 slender fingers gripped the device's frame. "Look at the joint structure, the angle of approach. This wasn't posed. This is something that actually used this device. The grip shows familiarity. And look here." He indicated a blurred human hand on the opposite side. "The human participant is manipulating this component in a way that suggests they understand the mechanism. This isn't just documentary photography. This is technical collaboration documentation." He sat back in his chair, still holding the magnifying glass. "Sarah, I've consulted on classified projects. I've seen experimental technologies decades ahead of public knowledge. But if this is genuine documentation from the 1960s, it means someone was working with principles we still don't fully understand, and they were teaching those principles to humans, or learning from humans." I said quietly. "Yes, or that." He looked at the photograph again. "The real question isn't whether this is authentic. The question is why it exists. Why document this? Why preserve evidence of something that would fundamentally challenge every assumption about technological development in human history? Because someone wanted the truth to survive," I answered, even if the participants themselves chose anonymity. That night I experienced what I can only describe as the weight of verification, the moment when possibility crystallized into probability, and probability into near certainty. The photographs weren't hoaxes. The materials weren't forgeries. The technology depicted was real, or at least represented real theoretical understanding far beyond what publicly acknowledged science had achieved in that era. I stood at my window, looking out over Portland's rain-soaked streets, and felt the vertigo that comes from realizing that consensus reality might be incomplete. Not wrong, incomplete. built on true foundations but missing crucial elements that had been deliberately edited out. The beings in the photographs were real. The collaboration was real. And sometime in late 1968 it had ended, possibly in fire, possibly in administrative termination, possibly in something I couldn't yet understand. The blurred faces haunted me most. I could see their hands, their postures, their body language suggesting everything from concentration to exhaustion to what might have been satisfaction in collaborative problem-solving. But I would never know their names, never see their faces, never be able to tell them that their work, whatever it had been, had survived in these 43 carefully preserved images. They had chosen erasure, and in doing so, they'd created something more powerful than recognition. They'd created testimony that transcended individual identity. The work itself became the monument. I made my second mistake that night. I wrote everything I'd discovered into a detailed research document, encrypted it, and sent copies to 3 trusted colleagues with instructions to open them only if something happened to me. I thought I was protecting the information. What I'd actually done was expand the circle of responsibility and risk. The response to my encrypted documents arrived faster than I'd anticipated. Within 72 hours, all 3 colleagues contacted me with variations of the same message. This was beyond their expertise, beyond their comfort level, and they strongly recommended I contact federal authorities. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, a historian at Berkeley who specialized in Cold War scientific programs, was most direct. Sarah, I've spent 30 years studying classified research programs. I've read thousands of declassified documents about projects that seemed impossible when first proposed. But this, if it's authentic, represents either the most elaborate hoax in modern history or evidence of collaboration that would rewrite every assumption about the 1960s scientific establishment. Either way, it's not something that should be investigated by private researchers. This needs institutional involvement. She was right. I knew she was right. But institutional involvement meant surrender of control, meant the photographs disappearing into classification systems that might keep them buried for another 60 years. It meant the choice made by those blurred figures, to document but remain anonymous, might be overridden by new decisions made by people who hadn't been there, hadn't done the work, hadn't earned the right to determine what should be known. I spent a week in a state of paralysis. The photographs spread across my apartment like evidence of something I couldn't quite name. During the day, I maintained my normal work, authenticating Civil War-era daguerreotypes, consulting on a collection of Depression-era documentary photography. At night, I returned to the Aquarius images, trying to extract meaning from gesture and posture since the faces remained forever obscured. The investigation became obsessive. I created detailed maps of the facility layout based on background elements visible across multiple photographs. I cataloged every piece of equipment, every visible document, every environmental detail. The tile pattern suggested installation in the early 1960s. The fluorescent fixtures matched models manufactured between 1961 and 1967. The institutional furniture appeared in General Services Administration catalogs from that era. But it was photograph number 37 that broke my analytical paralysis and forced me into action. I'd examined it dozens of times before, but on this viewing, late night, exhausted, coffee growing cold beside me, I noticed something in the background. On a desk, partially visible behind the primary subjects, lay what appeared to be a notebook or journal. Under maximum magnification, I could just make out handwritten text on the visible page. The handwriting was human. Definitely human. The letter formation, the slight rightward slant, the characteristic imperfections of manual writing, and I could read 3 partial words: communication breakthrough, and ethical framework, and what might have been mutual understanding. Someone had kept notes, personal documentation beyond the official photographs. And if those notes had survived, they might still exist somewhere, perhaps in a family archive, perhaps in a storage facility, perhaps forgotten in an attic. The woman who'd called me about her husband, Charles, she'd mentioned he worked on Aquarius. If he'd kept notes, if she'd preserved his papers. I found her through a combination of obituary searches and reverse phone number lookup. Charles Whitmore, retired aerospace engineer, died in 2003 in Las Cruces, New Mexico, survived by his wife Margaret and 2 adult children. The obituary mentioned his work on classified government research programs during the 1960s. Calling Margaret Whitmore felt like crossing a line I'd carefully avoided until now. Reaching out to sources was active investigation, not passive analysis. It meant accepting responsibility for whatever I uncovered and whatever consequences might follow. I made the call on a Thursday afternoon, hands shaking slightly as I dialed. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was stronger than it had been during our previous brief conversation, clearer, as if she'd been expecting this. "Dr. Chen," she said before I could introduce myself. "I wondered if you'd call back. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to ask you something delicate. Did your husband keep any personal records from his time on Project Aquarius? Notes, journals, anything beyond what might have been in official files?" Silence. I could hear a clock ticking in the background, could imagine her weighing what to say, how much to trust me. "He kept a journal," she finally said. "He didn't think I knew about it, but I found it after he died. He'd hidden it in the garage, wrapped in plastic inside a metal box. I've never shown it to anyone, I've barely looked at it myself. It felt like reading something too private, too important to be casual about. Would you be willing to let me see it?" Another pause. "Dr. Chen, why are you doing this? What do you hope to accomplish by uncovering something that powerful people went to great lengths to keep quiet?" It was the central question, the one I'd been avoiding asking myself directly. I looked at the photographs spread across my desk. Those blurred faces, those clear images of beings that shouldn't exist, that evidence of collaboration that defied everything I thought I knew about history. "Because they documented it," I said. "Whoever was there, they chose to create these photographs. Yes, they hid their own identities, but they preserved the evidence of what they'd done. That suggests they believed the truth was important enough to survive, even if they couldn't personally vouch for it. I think I owe them. I think we owe them the respect of understanding what they accomplished, even if understanding comes with consequences. Especially then, Margaret Whitmore invited me to Las Cruces. She asked me to come alone, to tell no one where I was going, and to be prepared for the possibility that what I learned might be something I wished I hadn't discovered. I booked a flight for the following Monday. Margaret Whitmore lived in a modest, adobe-style home on the outskirts of Las Cruces, the kind of place that seemed to absorb the desert heat and transform it into quiet stillness. She met me at the door, a woman in her mid-80s, silver hair pulled back, eyes that had seen too much to be easily surprised. She'd prepared tea. We sat in her living room, surrounded by photographs of her family, children, grandchildren, a younger version of herself with a man I assumed was Charles. None of the photos showed him in uniform or in any professional context. It was as if his work life had been carefully separated from his family identity. "Before I show you the journal," she said, "I need to tell you what Charles told me in the weeks before he died. He knew he was dying. Liver cancer, very aggressive. And he said he had a window of perhaps 2 weeks when he'd still be lucid enough to talk, but the pain medication wouldn't have clouded his memory too much." She set her teacup down with careful precision. "He told me that Project Aquarius wasn't about weapons or surveillance, or any of the usual Cold War obsessions. It was about understanding, literal, practical understanding between two intelligent species that had somehow found themselves sharing the same planet without either side being prepared for contact." "How did the contact happen?" I asked. He didn't know the full story. He was brought in after initial contact had already been established. But from what he gathered, it wasn't dramatic. It was accidental. A crash, yes, but not the Roswell crash that everyone talks about. Something else, something smaller in 1961, and instead of dying or being captured, the survivors asked for help. The simplicity of that phrase hit me like cold water. Asked for help. Charles said the beings were stranded. Their technology had failed in ways they couldn't repair without specific materials and knowledge they didn't have access to. And humanity in the early 1960s had just enough theoretical understanding and industrial capacity to potentially help, if both sides could communicate, could trust each other enough to collaborate. Margaret stood and walked to a bookshelf. From behind a row of gardening guides, she pulled out a metal box exactly as she'd described on the phone. She placed it on the coffee table between us but didn't immediately open it. Project Aquarius was the collaboration. A small group of scientists and engineers, fewer than 30 people over the 7 years it operated, working with a handful of beings who'd been stranded here. The goal was mutual survival, helping them repair their technology while learning from them in the process. But there were rules. Strict rules. She opened the box. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but intact, and several loose photographs that looked like personal copies of images from my collection. The rules were about protection. The beings insisted that human participants remain anonymous in any documentation because they understood what public knowledge of the collaboration would do to those people's lives, and the humans agreed to protect the beings' anonymity as well. No names, no identification of their origin, nothing that would let anyone trace them back to wherever they'd come from. I reached for the journal with trembling hands. Margaret nodded permission. Charles Whitmore's handwriting filled page after page, technical notes interspersed with personal reflections, sketches of devices and equations mixed with observations about his colleagues, both human and otherwise. One entry, dated April 1964, read, "Today we achieved communication breakthrough on the quantum entanglement problem. Dr. Rodriguez." They know I won't use her name in official records, but here in private I want to remember who was there. Finally understood what Chi Theta, not his real designation, but what we call him, because his actual name is unpronounceable, was trying to explain about non-local correlation. The moment of understanding was beautiful. She literally wept, and Chi Theta did something I've never seen before, touched her shoulder in what seemed like a gesture of shared joy. We're not just exchanging information. We're teaching each other how to think differently. I read page after page, each entry revealing not technical secrets, but emotional and ethical landscape of collaboration. The challenges of building trust across species barriers, the frustration of translation difficulties, the gradual development of genuine friendship despite profound differences. One entry from November 1967 showed the emerging ethical crisis. We're approaching completion. Within 6 months, they'll have what they need to repair their vessel. And then we face the central question we've all been avoiding. Do we report this? Do we tell the government, tell the world, about what we've accomplished here? The beings have made clear they'll leave no evidence beyond what we choose to preserve. They can remove all trace of their technology. They're offering us the choice: full disclosure or maintained secrecy. The next several pages detailed intense debates among the human participants. Some argued for full disclosure. Humanity deserved to know. Others insisted that revealing the collaboration would endanger both species. The beings might face pursuit or attack, while the human participants would be discredited, investigated, possibly imprisoned for maintaining unauthorized contact. The final entry, dated November 18, 1968, 2 days before the fire. We've made our decision. We'll preserve photographic evidence but protect all participants through anonymity. We'll hide the technical details in ways that might be discovered decades from now, when humanity is perhaps ready. And we'll let the world continue to debate whether we're alone or not, because the truth is we're not ready for that answer. Not yet. We've seen what we can accomplish through quiet collaboration. Imagine what loud disclosure would destroy. Sometimes the most ethical choice is silence, not permanent silence, but patient silence, letting the truth wait for readiness. Margaret was crying silently. The fire wasn't an accident, she said. Charles told me they said it themselves, a way to end the project officially, to create a clean break. The beings left that night. Charles never knew if they made it home. I returned to Portland with photocopies of Charles Whitmore's journal. Margaret had insisted the original remain with her, and a weight that sat differently than mere knowledge. This was testimony, witness, deliberate preservation of truth wrapped in protection. My second mistake had been sharing my preliminary findings with colleagues. My third mistake was assuming I could control what happened next. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo called on a Wednesday morning, her voice tight with a mixture of excitement and alarm. "Sarah, I need you to listen carefully without interrupting. After reviewing what you sent me, I consulted with a colleague in the Defense Department's Historical Classification Review Office. I didn't share specifics, just asked hypothetical questions about protocols for 1960s-era projects with unusual security classifications. My stomach dropped. Patricia, let me finish. Within 6 hours of my inquiry, I received a call from someone who identified himself as being from Institutional Memory Preservation. Those were his exact words. He asked if my interest in Project Aquarius was academic, or if I had access to primary source materials. Sarah, they're monitoring for exactly this kind of inquiry. They've been waiting for someone to find those photographs. I sat down slowly. What did you tell him? I said my interest was purely hypothetical, part of a broader research project on Cold War scientific cooperation programs. But Sarah, he didn't believe me. And more importantly, he didn't threaten me. He thanked me for my discretion, and asked that if I did encounter any materials related to Aquarius, I contact him before taking any action. He gave me a direct number. She paused. I could hear her breathing, could sense her uncertainty about whether she'd done the right thing. There's something else, she continued. He said something strange before hanging up. He said, the participants made specific choices about how the truth should be preserved. We're committed to honoring those choices, but we need to ensure the preservation happens responsibly. What did he mean by that? I thought about the blurred faces, about Charles Whitmore's final journal entry, about the deliberate decision to document without exposing. He means they're not trying to suppress the truth. They're trying to protect the people who created it. Over the next week, I received communications from 3 separate individuals, each approaching from different angles but all converging on the same essential message. What I'd found was real, was significant, and required careful handling. The first was an email from someone claiming to be the daughter of one of the Aquarius participants. She didn't provide her name or her parents' name, but she attached a photograph, one I didn't have in my collection. It showed the same facility, the same collaborative workspace but from a different angle, written on the back in faded ink, to prove it was real, in case anyone ever asks. But please, never seek our names. The second was a phone call from a retired CIA officer who'd worked in scientific intelligence during the 1970s. He told me that rumors of Aquarius had circulated in certain classified circles for decades, always unconfirmed, always deniable, but persistent enough that people who'd been in the intelligence community during that era knew something unusual had happened at Holloman in the mid-60s. The interesting thing, he said, was that nobody ever tried very hard to track down the details. It was as if there was an institutional understanding that some things from that era were better left as rumors. Not because they were dangerous, but because they represented, I don't know, maybe possibilities that we weren't ready to integrate into our worldview. Schrodinger's cat applied to history. As long as we don't look too closely, it can be both true and false. The third contact was the most unsettling. A package arrived containing a single item, a piece of the same unusual fiber I'd found in the original envelope, but this time embedded in what appeared to be a manufactured component, something technological, though I couldn't identify its purpose. Attached was a note in typewritten text. The collaboration produced results. Some remain in use, though their origin is forgotten. The truth isn't hidden in archives. It's embedded in technologies we use without understanding their full developmental history. You're looking for documentary evidence, but the real proof is everywhere, unrecognized. What does this change about your investigation? I showed the component to Dr. Robert Chen, the physicist who'd analyzed the original photographs. He examined it for 2 hours before delivering his conclusion. This is a beam splitter used in quantum optical systems. We manufacture these now, though they're expensive and difficult to produce. But Sarah, this component shows manufacturing techniques that don't match current production methods. The crystalline structure is too perfect, too uniform. It's as if someone made this using processes we've had to develop over decades, but they made it earlier, decades earlier. Could it be from the 1960s? The materials science says no, we couldn't make this in the 1960s. But the manufacturing markers suggest it wasn't made recently either. It's like something from a technological path that branched off from our development timeline and then converged back without anyone noticing. The implications settled over me like cold water. The Aquarius collaboration hadn't just happened and ended. It had left artifacts, technologies, possibly knowledge that had been quietly integrated into human scientific development without attribution, without acknowledgement. The blurred faces in the photographs had participated in something that continued to influence the present, but they'd chosen to remain unknown. And now I faced a choice: respect that decision by documenting without exposing, or pursue attribution and potentially violate the very ethical framework those participants had established. I thought about Charles Whitmore's journal entry. Sometimes the most ethical choice is silence, not permanent silence, but patient silence. How patient? How long should truth wait? The decision came not through analysis but through encounter, the kind of moment that feels staged by reality itself to force clarity. I was in my apartment on a Friday evening, March rain streaming down the windows, when my doorbell rang. I hadn't buzzed anyone up. The building's security was decent but not impenetrable, and my paranoia about the Aquarius materials had made me hyper-aware of every unusual occurrence. Through the peephole I saw an elderly man, perhaps in his late 70s, wearing a rain-dampened jacket and holding an envelope. His face was deeply lined, his posture slightly stooped, but his eyes were sharp and clear. I opened the door with the chain still engaged. "Can I help you?" "Dr. Chen, my name is David Brennan. I was one of them. One of the blurred faces. I need to talk to you about what you're planning to do with what you found." I stared at him through the gap in the doorway, my mind racing through verification protocols and security concerns and simple human shock. One of them, a primary source, a witness. I let him in. He sat in my living room, looking at the photographs I'd spread across my work table, and his hands trembled slightly as he picked up image number 12, the one showing a human and a being working together on the geometric device. "That's me," he said, pointing to the blurred figure. I was 32 years old. I'd just finished my doctorate in theoretical physics. They recruited me because I'd published a paper on non-linear optical phenomena that apparently came very close to describing something they understood, but we didn't. He set the photograph down carefully. "I've known for 15 years that someone had preserved copies of these images. We thought we'd destroyed all the documentation after the facility fire, but clearly someone kept a set. Several someones, probably. I've been waiting for them to surface, wondering what I'd do when they did." "Why come forward now?" I asked. "You've maintained anonymity for over 50 years. Because you're asking the right questions. Dr. Okonkwo's colleague contacted me. I'm one of several surviving participants they keep in touch with in case situations like this arise. They told me you weren't trying to expose us. You were trying to understand why we chose anonymity. That's different from what we feared." He looked around my apartment, at my authentication equipment, at my shelves of reference materials. We were terrified of becoming symbols, of having our work reduced to proof of conspiracy or validation of believers or ammunition for debunkers. We wanted the work itself to matter more than who did it. "What was the work?" I asked. "Really? Survival," he said, echoing what Margaret Whitmore had told me, but not just theirs. When we collaborated with them, when we learned to think the way they thought, we gained insights that have quietly influenced human scientific development for 50 years. Do you know how many papers on quantum mechanics, on photonics, on material science, trace their origins to insights that came from those 7 years? Not directly. We couldn't publish the actual source, but through careful translation of principles into human-compatible frameworks. He pulled out a folder from his jacket. "I brought you something. My own records. Not to be published, but so you'd understand the full scope of what you're dealing with." The folder contained technical diagrams, equations, and notes written in his handwriting. But more importantly, it contained a list, names and brief descriptions of technologies and theoretical insights that had emerged from the Aquarius collaboration, breakthroughs that had appeared in scattered publications throughout the 1970s and 1980s, advances that seemed to come from nowhere, from researchers who sometimes couldn't fully explain their own insights, pieces of a larger understanding, carefully fragmented and distributed, so that no single element would seem impossible or raise questions about origin. "We seeded human science with pieces of what we learned," David said quietly. "Not the full picture. That would have been too disruptive, but enough to accelerate development in directions that would eventually let humanity reach these insights independently. We became translators, bridges between their understanding and human capability." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you've found the photographs. Others will find them too eventually. And when they do, they'll face the same choice you're facing. Expose everything or preserve the framework of patient truth-telling that we established. I'm hoping you'll choose preservation." We talked for 3 hours. He told me about the beings, their patience, their own ethical struggles with whether to help or to leave humanity alone, their eventual decision that collaboration honored both species more than isolation. He described the gradual development of communication, the breakthroughs and frustrations, the moments of genuine friendship across incomprehensible difference. And he told me about the fire, how they'd documented everything carefully, how they'd helped their collaborators depart, and how they'd then deliberately destroyed the facility to create clean closure. The 3 casualties mentioned in the newspaper had been volunteers, he said, bodies provided by families who understood the need for official narrative. "We faked deaths?" I felt ill. "We created a story that would end inquiry," he corrected gently. The 3 people who supposedly died were real participants who took new identities and relocated. It was elaborate and probably illegal, and absolutely necessary to protect everyone involved. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Dr. Chen, you have a gift now." Knowledge of something true and significant. What you do with it will define whether our choice of anonymity was honored or violated. I trust you'll think carefully about which kind of truth-telling serves the actual truth. After he left, I sat alone with the photographs, with Charles Whitmore's journal photocopies, with David Brennan's technical notes, and with the weight of choice. The truth existed, the evidence existed, but the ethical framework surrounding that truth was as real and important as the facts themselves. 3 months have passed since David Brennan sat in my living room. The photographs remain in my possession, cataloged and preserved according to archival best practices. Charles Whitmore's journal excerpts are secured in encrypted storage. The unusual fiber samples are documented but not analyzed beyond what I've already learned. I've made my decision about what to do with what I've found, or perhaps more accurately, I've accepted the decision that was made for me by people who understood the implications better than I initially did. The photographs will be preserved. They'll be donated to a secure archive with specific instructions. They may be accessed by researchers, but only under controlled conditions, and with the understanding that they represent collaborative work whose participants chose anonymity. The documentation will note that human faces were deliberately obscured by the original processors of the images, and that this choice should be respected. There will be no press releases, no dramatic revelations, no attempt to force public consciousness to confront what happened at Holloman Air Force Base between 1962 and 1968. Instead, the materials will exist as evidence for anyone willing to look carefully, to think deeply, to ask questions about gaps in our understanding of 20th century scientific development. The truth will be preserved but not weaponized, documented but not sensationalized. I've written this account, this testimony, knowing it will exist in a similar liminal space between disclosure and discretion. It's true. All of it is true, as best as I can verify and confirm. But I'm also aware that its existence changes nothing immediately, while potentially changing everything eventually. David Brennan died 2 weeks ago. His obituary mentioned a distinguished career in optical physics and numerous contributions to quantum computing development. It did not mention Project Aquarius. At his funeral, 3 other elderly physicists attended, people I didn't recognize but who regarded me with quiet acknowledgement when I introduced myself. One of them, a woman in her 80s, approached me afterward. "He told us he'd talk to you," she said. "We're glad someone knows. Someone outside our closed circle. It makes it real in a different way, having a witness who wasn't there." "Were you?" "Yes. I was 28. I learned more in those 7 years than in all my education before or after." She paused, looking at the rain beginning to fall outside the chapel. "I've lived with this knowledge for 54 years, knowing what we achieved, knowing I could never fully explain how I developed certain insights that became important to my field. It's lonely, carrying truth you can't share." "Why not share it?" I asked. "You're near the end of your lives. What can they threaten you with now?" She smiled sadly. "It's not about threats, it's about respecting what they chose. The beings who worked with us, they trusted us to handle contact in a way that wouldn't endanger them or their kind. Revealing everything now, after they're presumably long gone, feels like betraying that trust. Besides," she gestured at the world beyond the chapel walls, "look at how we treat each other, how we handle difference, how we respond to otherness. Would knowing about them make us better or just give us new things to fear and fight over?" I've thought about her question constantly since that conversation. The truth I've uncovered doesn't provide easy answers. It confirms that we're not alone, that contact has occurred, that collaboration between human and non-human intelligence is possible. But it also demonstrates that such collaboration requires careful protection, ethical frameworks, and willingness to prioritize preservation over recognition. Margaret Whitmore calls me occasionally. We talk about her husband, about his journal, about the choices he made. She's relieved that the truth is documented but not exposed, preserved but not weaponized. Charles used to say that some knowledge is like seeds, she told me last week. You don't plant them by throwing them everywhere. You plant them carefully in soil that's ready, and you trust that when conditions are right, they'll grow. The Aquarius photographs are those seeds now, preserved in an archive where researchers can find them, documented in accounts like this one, which may circulate quietly among people willing to consider uncomfortable possibilities, protected by the same framework of ethical anonymity that the original participants established. I've returned to my regular work. authenticating historical photographs, consulting on collections, teaching occasional workshops on photographic analysis. But I carry the weight of what I know now, the understanding that consensus reality has gaps, and that some of those gaps were deliberately maintained by people trying to honor both truth and responsibility. The fiber samples I tested, the ones showing impossible manufacturing characteristics, remain unexplained. Dr. Robert Chen has quietly incorporated some questions raised by their analysis into his ongoing research. He doesn't cite their origin. He simply follows the implications where they lead, which is perhaps exactly what the Aquarius participants hoped would happen. I sometimes wonder if the beings they collaborated with are still watching, still paying attention to how we handle the knowledge they shared. I imagine them somewhere distant, monitoring our development, waiting to see if we mature into a species capable of contact without catastrophe. Or perhaps they left and never looked back, content that they'd planted seeds of understanding that would grow according to human timeframes at human pace. Either way, I'm convinced of this. The truth of Project Aquarius, the reality of that 7-year collaboration, exists now in a form that respects both what happened and why the participants chose to document it as they did. The blurred faces remain blurred. The anonymity remains protected. But the evidence of what humans and others accomplished together, that survives, waiting for the day when we're collectively ready to understand what it means. Some discoveries aren't about revelation. They're about bearing witness. I've become that witness. And this account is my testimony to the careful truth-telling of people who collaborated with the impossible and chose to protect that collaboration, even as they documented it. The photographs exist. The truth exists. And sometimes that's enough.